last 3 episodes, we've been going over the template helpers of Liquid-Fire. In doing that, we've been using lots of transitions as defined in the transition map. However, we haven't done a rigorous overview of what these are, so that's what we're going to do this time. So in the transition map, which is what you put into transitions.js, there are 2 top-level functions. The first is transition. That's what we've been using. And so a transition consists of a use statement, and you'll see that each of these does have a use statement, and then it says 1 or more constraints. And a constraint is something like from route or has class. The second top-level function is setDefault. And so it's linking to something called velocity.defaults. Now, velocity.js is the JavaScript library that's underlying Liquid-Fire. It's what does a lot of the animations for us. And Liquid-Fire is a really nice DSL on top of that. So we can set a lot of default options. You'll notice we've used duration before. And so these are things that you can also set in the use property of the transition. So here are a bunch of the options with their defaults. And if you want to change those defaults, you can. And if you want to look at the documentation for them, it's all here. However, in this video, we're not going to go over velocity.js. Instead, we're going to look at all the matchers that we can put into this transition map. We'll start with the route and model constraints. So from route and to route will probably be the ones that you use most often, at least at the beginning. And they're very well named, very self-explanatory. So you can have either one or both. You can see here that in this first one, it doesn't matter where we're going as long as we're coming there from the monsters index. Whereas in this transition, we have to go from the show route to the edit route, or vice versa. Within route is, well, I'm not really sure how to use this. So I spent a lot of time trying to make the thing that we ended up putting into Liquid Bind, this transition. I spent a lot of time trying to make that work with within route, but it doesn't. So I guess it might be good for query parameters? I'm not sure. And the same thing applies to the from model, to model, and between models. I can't find them in any of these examples. And I tried it here. Here I'm going to log out whenever the from model is triggered. So I thought maybe this would be how we would accomplish this without the Liquid Bind. But it's not logging anything. It does, however, log whenever we go from the edit or the show route to a different route. So I'm not exactly sure on the use case of this. But the syntax, if you're curious, is to pass it a function, and first argument is the old model, second is the new model, and that's reversed if you do to model. And then you return a Boolean that says whether you're going to do this transition or not. Next up is matching by value. Value constraints only apply to liquid if and the liquid bind helpers because they're the ones that are passed values. We can see that happening here in this liquid if, so it's passed the isHighLevel Boolean. Then in our transition map, we can see this is the transition that's based on that liquid if, and we're using the toValue method. So the toValue constraint, one of the things that can be fed is a Boolean. For the if helper, that's all it can be fed, or all it really makes sense to feed it. And so here it can be true or false, and you remember this determines the directionality of the if statement. The liquid bind helper, on the other hand, is fed more than just Booleans. Here it's being fed an entire model. So that means the from value and to value for a liquid bind can be more complex. Specifically, in addition to being a Boolean, it could also be a simple string or a number. It can be null, which will match null or undefined, or it can be a regular expression or a function. The function is the most complex, so that's the one we'll spend a little bit more time on. So the function looks like this. It takes the value as the argument, and then the return value will be a Boolean, which tells you whether or not you're going to run that transition. One cool use case for this, done halfway here, is when you're going to a lower number, you go one way, and when you're changing to a higher number, you go the other way, so it looks like it's all on one number line. You can accomplish that with value constraints. So the next type of constraint is media query. When I first read about these, I imagined that it would animate when I did this, such as when it bounces between, it's right there. But what it actually is it'll change what animations are displaying based on what size the screen currently is. So if you want things to look differently on mobile, this is where you go. Next are the constraints based on DOM context. We've already seen hasClass, and we've used hasClass in 2 of our transitions for our if statement and for our liquid bind. In this particular case, we're matching on the class liquidMonster, and that class is on our liquid bind template helper. But hasClass isn't the only DOM constraint. There's matchSelector, which matches based on CSS selectors, so it can be a class, it can be an ID, or any of the other more obscure things. So if the selector matches, then the transition is a go. Child of is similar, but it's checking the parent rather than the element itself. You'll remember we used this in one of our previous episodes. Lastly, we have inHelper, and what it does is it specifies it to one of the 4 different template helpers. Here we're using liquidIf as the example. Then in our last set of constraints, we have initial render. So by default, it's not animating during the initial render, but you can make it do that. You can make it happen only on the initial render, or you can do it during the default as well as the initial render. So that's our overview of the transition map, specifically with the matching constraints that you can have on the various transitions. I hope to see you next time when we talk more about the animations, specifically more advanced animations like creating an explode animation. I'll see you then.